decision of the conference, the 16th conference of the parties to the CBD, adopting the modalities for operationalizing the multilateral mechanism for the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources, including a global fund. In this webinar, 3 very capable experts who have been involved in the negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity will tell us about the key aspects you can see on the screen now. Michael will talk about payment obligations for users of digital sequence information. Matthew will tell us about expectations in relation to databases. And Claudio will explain the relationships between this new mechanism for benefit sharing and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and also next steps that were agreed by the Conference of the Parties in the same decision. They will explain what the COP decision says and also what it does not say, meaning things that were considered at some point during the negotiations and that were left out of the table. They will also explore the implications of these aspects of the decisions made by the COP for the CGIAR and the CGIAR centers, what needs to be done from our side, and also what we can expect others will do in response to this COP decision. And hopefully we will have plenty of time for getting and answering your questions and also to have a little bit of a discussion. So please feel free to write your questions on the chat, although I do prefer that you just raise your hands and we will take your questions at several points during the webinar. This decision is this COP decision is the result of a long journey that started more than 10 years ago and that gained speed in the last 2 years. It is also a first step towards the establishment of an international system, a robust international system for the sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of digital sequence information. In my view, it is this decision is a good document. It's a good step ahead, in the sense that the text itself is very well structured, is clear, the provisions are clear, they cover all the important aspects that were considered in the last years. In fact, it is almost a miracle that the COP managed to adopt this good quality decision when at the beginning of the meeting they didn't even have a draft text, a draft negotiating text they could work on, and so many things were still in the air. CGIAR has contributed to this result, participating in meetings, organizing side events, and submissions to the Conference of the Parties and other bodies of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have been very active, particularly in the DSI scientific network, and this has led to several interesting results, such as articles published in scientific journals and in other channels. In the last 2 years, we have organized various webinars to update the CGIAR community about the status of these negotiations. So if you want to learn more about the background of this decision, where it comes from, what the different issues that were considered along the way, and how it looks like today, you can visit our webpage, which we maintain regularly, on digital sequence information and plant genetic resources, which is part of the CGIAR website. And I kindly ask Cinzia, Michael, or the people in the webinar, in this Teams call, to please put the link to this webpage on the chat of the webinar. So jumping straight into the content of this decision, I'm going to cover just this small aspect, which is a small but relevant aspect, which is the scope of the multilateral mechanism of access and benefit sharing for digital sequence information. So this multilateral mechanism has been designed to apply to digital sequence information on genetic resources that is publicly available, meaning that is already publicly available on public databases. B, that is not subject to conditions established at the time of access to genetic resources, so for which there are no conditions already negotiated by the country, the provider country, and the user of the genetic resource and the digital sequence information, and for which there is no beneficiary system established by another international instrument, except in the case when such other international instrument has decided to use this multilateral mechanism as the system, the beneficiary system for digital sequence information that will fall under that other international instrument. And an important thing to point out is that digital sequence information, this term, this concept, and its boundaries haven't been defined by the Conference of the Parties. There is no definition of this term in the decision that the COP adopted for the implementation of this multilateral mechanism. As many of you know, negotiations about the scope of the term DSI were extremely difficult. Reaching an agreement on this proved to be very, very difficult, if not impossible. So the COP decided to go ahead without a definition of DSI. All this means that even if the scope of the multilateral system has been clearly defined, what DSI actually means is not clear yet, and therefore subject to interpretation. I'm going to stop here and pass the floor to Michael, who's going to speak about how beneficiary, particularly monetary beneficiary, has been structured in this COP decision. Thank you.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, terrific. All right. Well, as Isabel said, perhaps the biggest miracle was that there was a decision at all at the end of the week. With respect to benefit sharing for digital sequence information, it's been a controversial issue for a long time. So the fact that we're this far is, in a way, miraculous. The decision starts off with a very general statement with respect to benefit sharing, just saying that all users of digital sequence information on genetic resources under the multilateral mechanism should share benefits in fair and equitable ways. And that refers both to monetary and non-monetary benefit sharing. And now I want to focus in on the monetary benefit sharing thing in particular. In paragraph 3, it states, and this is a direct quotation, users of digital sequence information on genetic resources in sectors that directly or indirectly benefit from its use in their commercial activities should contribute a portion of their profits or funds revenue to the global fund according to their size. And then it goes on to provide more details with respect to the kinds of companies or the size of companies that they're regulating. And it says here that if a company exceeds two of the following thresholds, either its total assets exceed 20 million or its sales exceed $20 million a year, or profit exceeds $50 million per year, such companies should contribute 1% of their profits or 0.1% of their revenue to the Cali fund. Now you'll see there's also as an indicative rate, so that very much softens the obligation, but nonetheless the obligation is expressed thusly. Now you'll notice this is not the standard way of constituting benefit sharing linked to access and benefit sharing regulations. You'll know from the CBD that the focus has tended to be on following the use of genetic resources into new individual products and their commercialization. Under the Plant Treaty, it has to do with following products and portfolios of products and their commercialization. Here, the formulation for benefit sharing obligations is cast much more broadly to look at companies that are active in sectors that are directly or indirectly benefit. So we're not looking at particular products. We're not even looking at particular portfolios of products. We're looking at the values of companies and the values of their sales overall. Having said that, it does also state in the decision that it doesn't apply to entities that do not directly or indirectly use digital sequence information on genetic resources. And it also includes a schedule for future decisions to be made by COP17 and thereafter, wherein they'll set out rates and obligations for payments by smaller companies than those that are described here. And in this context, it's very relevant that there's an explicit exclusion in the decision for entities operating public databases and public research and academic institutions. So CGIAR is not required to pay under this decision. Here is the list of sectors that are included at the end of the decision. And you'll see here the predictable ones, for us at least, animal and plant breeding, biotechnology. But I've put little red asterisks beside F and G, because here you see the sectors are defined not by users that would take and incorporate digital sequence information or genetic resources in final products, but they're engaged in services that depend on the use of such information. And here in G, you'll see reference even to technical services, including artificial intelligence. So we've got quite a broad remit for thinking about the kinds of companies and the kinds of uses that trigger benefit sharing. So all that sounds good. The devil is in the details. The decision also says that parties and non-parties are invited to take administrative, policy, or legal measures consistent with national legislation to incentivize users in their jurisdictions to contribute to the fund. So while it starts off with a very strong should statement in paragraph 3 related to companies, here we see where the rubber hits the road, a much weaker formulation. Under international law, normally it is states that are the subjects of decisions, and it's their job to translate those obligations or rights to constituents within their jurisdictions. So here you have, as I say, a fairly strong normative statement in paragraph 3, but when it comes to what states are actually going to do to make that a reality on the ground, you have a much weaker formulation. A number of parties had hoped that this paragraph would say parties agreed to take measures requiring users in their jurisdictions to make payments. In such a situation, you would know that payments would be made, and you would know that there would be money coming into the fund automatically. This formulation that we currently have requires, well, we don't know what measures states are going to put in place, but it's almost a certainty that they will not be going home and saying to companies, you have to make payments. The other incentive, whoops, my screen is frozen. That's not good. The other incentive built into the decision for companies to make payments is that in the year that they make payments, following that paragraph 3 formulation, they will receive a certificate which will indemnify them from further benefit sharing claims linked to their use of data within the multilateral mechanism. Now, this is meant to provide them with legal certainty, and that legal certainty is supposed to be incentive enough for those companies to volunteer to make payments. The bit of the problem here is that there may still be too much uncertainty about what data is actually within or outside the scope of the multilateral mechanism, because throughout the negotiations, we were not successful in drawing a red line between what kind of data is in the multilateral mechanism and what kind of data is subject to national digital sequence information ABS laws. And there are more and more of those national laws all the time. So the legal certainty that is meant to be the incentive for companies to voluntarily make the payments may not be strong enough. Are there additional incentives to pay if one looks beyond the text? And I think, yes, there are. One, obviously, is the interest in companies for reputation building and as an expression of their corporate social responsibility. And the flip side of that, of course, is the fear of name and shame campaigns that civil society organizations, for example, could now pursue now that there is an internationally endorsed standard of behavior that's been expressed in that fairly strong normative statement in paragraph 3. So will any of this give rise to some more substantial payments? It's really too early to say. There's a lot of gray area here. And I think it will be a year or two before we can see trends emerging as to whether or not companies come forward and make payments under these circumstances. Very quickly, the funds that would be contributed pursuant to this formulation are meant to be deposited in something called the CALI Fund for Benefit Sharing. And a decision has been made that allocation of funds would be directly to countries. Up to half of that could be to Indigenous peoples and local communities, depending on national circumstances. The formula for determining how much each country should get directly is still under development and will be decided at the next meeting of the COP in 2026. But it includes consideration of biodiversity richness, origin of the genetic resources from which the DSI was derived, and capacity building needs. And it will overall be used to support conservation, sustainable use, capacity building. Finally, with respect to non-monetary benefit sharing, the decision by COP doesn't really have much new of substance. It states that there will be a clearinghouse mechanism run by the Convention on Biological Diversity to provide information on capacity sharing needs by others. And there will be a monitoring framework for the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adopted in February this year. And depending on how it's structured and the kind of indicators it includes, it could be a very useful tool for organizations like our own, keeping track of what we're doing to generate non-monetary benefits and to be maybe better at planning delivery and of such benefits for partners down the road. So I will say no more and pass the microphone on.
So, hello everyone. So my name is Mathieu Roy, so I work for the Alliance, and I'm going to talk about DSI database management, because it was one of the topics that was highly discussed during the DSI negotiation. And to fully understand, to fully appreciate the final decision, I think this is important to explain from where we started before the conference, before the COP. So at COP15, the agreement was to find a solution for the use of DSI that would be practical and that would be consistent with open access. However, 2 months before COP, a working group on DSI was held in Montreal again, and some parties decided to introduce a new text dedicated to database governance, arguing that there was actually a lack of accountability, transparency, and inclusiveness in existing databases. And in particular, in this text, there was one subparagraph, the paragraph E, that intended to put a lot of pressure on database manager to act as a regulator or as a police for ABS compliance. So what the text was saying is that any new sequence that would be submitted should be accepted in those databases only if a legal document from national authorities from the country of origin would be provided. So given the volume of data and the expertise of the staff of the databases, so it was really an impractical solution, and it could have caused a huge bottleneck for data release in the scientific community. So many stakeholders were concerned about that, including us. So we gather evidence, we work on policy briefs that were published, and to better inform policymakers about the risk of such a decision. So going to COP16, we were ready to engage with negotiators about that. And one of the first opportunity for engagement was an official side event that we had on the first day of the conference, so organized by the policy unit. And several colleagues, including Peter Wenzel, Sarah Hearn, and Michael Alwood, gave a lot of detail about the operation of DSI, what were the perspectives from the CGIAR. But there was also one time slot dedicated to database, where I gave the global context of databases in DSI for the scientific community, and more specifically in the CGIAR. So after 2 weeks of long discussion, tense negotiation, inside event, in contact groups, we finally got a final agreement, including this paragraph 10, without any bracket, that is supposed to regulate, the database obligation for all databases that provide open access to DSI information. And I think the easiest way to guide you through the different paragraphs, because you have 5 paragraphs from A to E, is probably to give a graphical example. So let's consider that scientists are going to select plants or microorganisms or animals to sequence them and to generate some DSI, digital sequence information. So it would be considered as such. So at some point, some scientists are going to analyze the data and to make some publication out of it. So to publish, they will be requested to publish those data, to upload those data as open access in the major genomic repositories. So this is where the decision can have some implication, because there would be some possible obligation. So the first one would be that the person submitting the data would be requested by the database to indicate that DSI are not subjected to restriction preventing the sharing of data. So that's a first obligation that is new to most databases. Then a second element would be that once your data are uploaded, you need to provide as a mandatory information the country of origin that is related to the genetic resources that has been sequenced, as well as, whenever applicable, information on traditional knowledge with regards to IPLC, for instance. Then those major genomic repositories must be consistent with open access, so which is good, but they need also to take into consideration a number of good practices in data management. So there are a number of acronyms: FAIR, CARE, and TRUST principle that I am not going to explain now because I don't have time, but this is for further exploration. And then at the end, when people are going to access those data, they must be informed by the database about the existence of the multilateral mechanism and the possibility to contribute to the global fund that Michael explained just before. So, and then it's up to them to reuse those data to make publication or to make secondary databases. So that's the basic principle of this article. This is where we stand at the end of the decision. And now it's up to each system, each database, to figure out how they could apply this decision if they want to do it. So this is what we have done as an example in the CGIAR Gene Bank initiative. So we have this portal that was set up to provide a way to share genotyping data for material available in CGIAR gene banks. So if we consider, for instance, the paragraph 10D with regard to open access, once data are ready and shared, it's possible to make them open access. It is already aligned with the FAIR principle, so we would be more or less okay for this part. So we need probably to explore a bit more about the CARE principle and the TRUST principle, but this would be aligned with the decision. Now, if we look at the 10A, where we need to inform users about the existence of the multilateral mechanism, any people accessing the website for the first time see this type of window about the term of use of the system. So it would be probably a matter just to add some text, something like that. So I made it quickly, so it's not a formal text. We would require a formal text, just to say that there is a multilateral mechanism, and if you want more information, so you can be redirected to the CBD website. And we hope that the CBD is going to provide a clear guidance and website to redirect people. Then, with regards to the paragraph 10C, where you need to indicate the country of origin. So it's part of current and evolving best practices. So for instance, this is one data set that we have in the system, and you have the country of origin. Most of them have it. It is part of the passport data for gene bank material, so it will not be a big deal. Here, it's mostly about making sure that this information is mandatory when people submit the data, and to give the possibility as well to add additional field for traditional knowledge. And then maybe the trickiest part was related to 10, not 10B, but 10E. about requesting people to confirm that they have the right to submit the data. So what we can imagine here is that through the data submission interface that you have on the screen, it should be quite easy to add a checkbox that people select at the end just to certify or confirm that they have the permission to search the data. So this is what we can imagine at the moment, a few weeks after the decision. Of course, there is more work to do, but this is what we could see already for one of the systems, and each database will have to imagine what could be the implication for their own interface. So as a summary, releasing data as open access continue to be supported as best practices. The recommendation for database manager might be relatively easy to comply, but as I explained, everyone will have to see and figure out how they should modify the system. So it's important to say as well that a lot of responsibility is shift to the data uploader. So it may require for people to be aware of that and also maybe to get some training about genetic resources policies. And this is a good opportunity, I think, to advertise for this online training that is given by the policy unit. There is a new session planned for early next year. And it's good to remind as well that material received under the SMTA can be sequenced, and data can be shared online without additional authorization at the moment. And there may be in the future additional obligation coming from negotiation in the PROM treaty, but that will be probably discussion for another seminar. So with that, that's the end of my section. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Matthew. This was very clear. I love that diagram showing the implications of this decision for DSI generators and those who want to share the DSI online on public databases. Thanks very much. Claudio, it's now your turn. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Isabel, and good afternoon, good time of the day to all of you. So in my part of the presentation, I'll be focusing on a portion of DSI that is really to the core of our business, looking at the relationship between the multilateral mechanism under the CBD and other instruments, in particular the plant treaty. So the first thing I'd like to highlight is that, of course, the international community is currently considering new rules for the sharing of benefits from the use of digital sequence information under the framework of the plant treaty and the package of measures that are aimed at enhancing the functioning of the multilateral system and also expanding its scope is meant to be adopted in November 2025 at the next meeting of the governing body of the treaty. And of course, this is important for CGIAR because the new rules under both the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Plant Treaty need to be mutually supportive and should not create unnecessary burdens for research and development. So, of course, the COP decision that establishes the multilateral mechanism has taken note of such developments under different UN bodies and treaties relating to the regulation of particular subsets of digital sequence information, and has also highlighted that implementation of the multilateral mechanism should be undertaken without prejudice to both national access and benefit sharing measures adopted by countries bilaterally, as well as without prejudice to rights and obligation of those parties that might derive from their, being part to other international agreements, such as the Plant Treaty. So importantly, as Isabel has recalled at the very beginning, the scope of the multilateral mechanism is defined in Article 1, and in particular, paragraph C highlights that the digital sequence information that is covered by the multilateral mechanism under the CBD is only that for which benefit sharing is not provided for by other international agreements. So in principle, if benefit sharing from DSI of PGRFA is going to be regulated elsewhere, then that other instrument will apply. It's also important to recall Article 27 of the same decision, where it is stated that implementation of the multilateral mechanism should take place in a way that is mutually supportive and adaptive to other international instruments, and to avoid the stacking of obligation with respect to benefit sharing, and to streamline relevant processes under the different treaties. And of course, it also invites the governing bodies of these other instruments and treaties to collaborate with the multilateral mechanism to achieve the above purposes. So the current state of play under the plant treaty is that, as I mentioned earlier, there is an ongoing work with respect to the enhancement of the multilateral system, and the parties of the plant treaty have agreed, at least in principle, that they would focus on a solution for digital sequence information from PGRFA as part of the MLS enhancement process, in particular under the subscription system, if that's a subscription-only system. That is to say, under the expanded scope of the multilateral system of the FAO treaty, a subscriber would make payments based on the annual sales of any plant genetic resources of food and agriculture that they decide to commercialize on a certain percentage. This is to simplify a little bit things. So any subscriber would pay annually a certain amount based on his or her sales. However, for a certain number of countries, particularly North America, and also for private companies, it's important to retain also the option to have a single access or a deferred payment option under the system. So this will mean that a subscriber would have to pay under the enhanced multilateral system only when, at the point in time when a product is brought to the market, and that product would have to physically incorporate PGRFA that have been received from the multilateral system. So in this latter case, obviously there is a clear link to incorporation, as it is currently under the Standard Material Transfer Agreement, and therefore digital sequence information would not be by default addressed, no, under this scenario. And so for DSI to be covered under a scenario where we would have also a deferred payment option, it will be necessary to deal with that either directly in the Standard Material Transfer Agreement, or perhaps to have a mandate to request the CBD, for example, to say, then you deal with it in the context of the multilateral mechanism. This is to sum up. So what I would like to point out and emphasize at this point is, which is very important, is that there is an issue of kind of temporal application of this mechanism. So the current situation is that the multilateral mechanism, the CBD, in principle, is immediately applicable and has amongst its sectors also plant and animal breeding, as Michael has pointed out earlier, while the enhanced multilateral system that would cater perhaps also for the sharing of benefits from PGRFA in the multilateral system, from the DSI derived from those PGRFA is not yet there. It will be adopted later on. So at least until the 11th meeting of the governing body, for now, benefit sharing from DSI on PGRFA that is in the multilateral system falls within the scope of the multilateral mechanism. So this, I think, is an important point. Once the new enhanced multilateral system kicks in, depending on how it has been established and elaborated, then the scope, this DSI would be, again, within scope of the multilateral system of the treaty. Now, I wanted just to provide some figures to illustrate a little bit what is exactly that we are talking about in terms of monetary benefits. So the global seed market is estimated approximately at 53,525 million only in 2023. So that's the global size of the commercial seed market. There are different companies, of course, that contribute to it, but let's say that the companies that are from 50 million above in terms of sales annually, they account approximately for 92% of the total of industrial seed market. So that means that 50 million, I'm highlighting this here, because as you may recall from Michael's presentation, that's the threshold above which companies would be expected to contribute into the multilateral mechanism under the CBD, right? If that is one of the three thresholds, then there's a second one out of three that has to be met, but this is just to have a reference term here. So basically, to sum all this up, that means that in principle, there is an expectation that these companies, just from the plant breeding sector, could contribute, if they make payment based on the parameters that have been given by the decision, that is 0.1% of sales, they would contribute up to basically $39.2 million per year into the Cali Fund, which is a good sum of money. This is just to show you the 11 companies that are in the tier 1 kind of range, that is companies that have sales above 500 million per year, just to show you who the big players are. And obviously these are often active in different sectors, and not just plant breeding, but also other sectors, agrochemicals and so on. Now, without getting lost into the details, in this table, I just wanted to show a little comparison between scope, triggers, and basis for payments under the theoretical scenario if a multilateral system is enhanced and approved by the governing body in November 2025, and the current triggers and basis for payments under the current multilateral mechanism as established by the CBD. So what I'd like to draw your attention to is that in a very simplified scenario where we have, all PGRFA potentially included into the multilateral system, so not just Annex 1, and we have a very simple system that is subscription only, everybody who subscribes would pay based on commercialization of PGRFA, then we will have in this scenario potentially some area of overlap, and therefore the risk of stacking of obligation that we want to avoid. It would be very important to avoid. However, these might require further cooperation between the respective governing bodies. So I've identified at least 3 situations that I think are important, but I'll stick just to the first one for the sake of time, which I think is the most significant in terms of market value. So that is the case of transgenic crops, where one might expect a user to have used digital sequence information from an organism that is not plant genetic resources, food and agriculture, therefore DSI, that would be outside the scope of the enhanced multilateral system, the hypothetically enhanced multilateral system, in conjunction with, for example, corn obtained from the multilateral system. So in conjunction with PGRFA or DSI from the multilateral system to get to a final product that is the BT corn, right? So this is very important because in this case, payments could be expected under the multilateral mechanism for the use of the digital sequence information of the bacteria, but they could also be expected under the multilateral system based on the commercialization of the end product, which is PGRFA, if the entity is a subscriber of the multilateral system, obviously. So this is one example, and obviously is a very important one because the market for GM seeds accounts approximately to close to half of the total market of seed sales in 2023. So obviously, cooperation between the different, the governing body of the treaty and the CBD Secretariat in the administration of the multilateral mechanism under CBD would have to be enhanced, and we can see that there could be some friction as to where this money should be flowing, you know, in cases where companies are subscribers and contributors to the MLM at the same time. I will skip the other example, but of course we can talk about it later or maybe in some other future briefings. I'd like just to conclude by highlighting some points that have been raised earlier as well by Michael and Nicolas and Mathieu, Pathieu and Isabel. So the multilateral mechanism and its modalities for benefit sharing are without prejudice and will coexist with both international ABS instrument, but also with national ABS legislation that might extend to DSI. So this is a first important point. This is a voluntary mechanism, and because of its voluntary nature, it will be difficult to predict exactly what is its capacity to attract and redirect some commercial benefits from DSI users towards the conservation of biodiversity. And in my view, this is largely dependent on the perceived legal certainty that companies might be expected to acquire when making payments into the multilateral mechanism through the certificate that Michael has described earlier. Probably this legal certainty is not necessarily going to be huge because precisely there are other regulations that are being set in place, even bilaterally by countries, and that would detract from the scope of the multilateral mechanism as such. So this is kind of a mutually reinforcing negative circuit potentially, because the more countries don't see money flowing into the Cali Fund, the more they might be pushed in regulating ABS for DSI bilaterally, trying to get directly some benefits. The smaller the pool of resources that are put into the MLM and so on. So this hopefully has to be absolutely avoided going forward. But to conclude on a positive note, I'd like to say that of course, the mechanism leaves digital sequence information use free of charge for research purposes, as was highlighted earlier, preserving the capacity of our centers to continue using and making DSI available for the production and as a global public good. This, of course, was very important, is very important for us. And also for databases, as we have seen in Mathieu's presentation, there's a positive new universal due diligence standards that are being developed and that need to be further integrated into our best practices, tools and platforms. And these will surely help making DSI more widely available and accessible in transparent and accountable way. So I think these are two very positive aspects, despite the uncertainty surrounding other elements of the mechanism.